A Hoofs on Education by Brutalassmaster. The rain poured down outside the library windows, filling the air with a kind of strange rhythm that was both random and familiar. Ponyville was quiet now, much quieter than it had been a few hours earlier when a cranky Ursa Minor had destroyed half the town. Twilight Sparkle sighed as she stared at the large pile of books on her table, not looking forward to the hours of studying before her. She was so tired and strangely confused by the day's events. When she had first seen Trixie, she had been worried about her position as Ponyville's top magician, but realized very quickly that there was no real threat from this new blue unicorn. Still, there was something strangely arousing about having another unicorn in town who could even hope to rival her in magical abilities. Twi was, however, much too tired to think about it much, instead opting to face the large books and scrolls and lose herself in learning. She opened the first book and stared blankly at the title page. "How did this get in my study pile?" she thought aloud, closing Nifty Tricks for Sticky Situations and opening the next one. "Seriously?" she shouted, throwing the new offending book across the room. The Khmer Sutra hit a shelf and opened to a page with a picture of two unicorns. Twilight, in spite of herself, was curious to see what in Equestria those two ponies were doing. She approached the book hesitantly, as if it could explode at any moment, and then explode again. When she saw the picture, however, she immediately felt herself go bright red. The two female unicorns, for this was the Khmer Sutra after all, were lying on top of each other. One had her snout deep between the other's legs, but the other, she had stuck her horn right into... Twilight felt her legs give out underneath her. She was no prude, and she had seen something similar once in her parents' drawer, but it was not so much what she saw on the page, but what she saw in her mind. As soon as she had seen that picture of those two unicorns in that strange position, an image of two unicorns, not just some generic drawing, had sprung into her mind. "How can I think of Trixie like that, after she was so mean to me and my friends?" But the mind does not lie, and the heat she felt in her cheeks was nothing to the heat she felt between her legs, her virgin orifice swelling and wetting itself like there was no tomorrow. It was at that moment the bell rang. Twilight flew into a blind panic. If Spike had been there, she would have sent him to get it instead, but he was out trying to seduce Rarity with his new stash. "Who is it?" she called tentatively. No pony answered. "Oh, pony feathers," she said, pulling herself back up, donning a robe quickly and cantering towards the door. "This ought to cover most of it. Well, enough for me to get rid of whoever's calling at this time of night." She froze, however, when she opened the door and saw who it was. A drenched and bedraggled Trixie stood, ears low, tail between her legs, on Twilight's doorstep. "I'm sorry to she started to say, but stopped short when she saw who opened the door. She immediately turned and started to leave. "Wait!" shouted Twilight. "Why am I calling her back? Don't go! No pony should be out in this weather." "But you hate me, and I hate you," muttered Trixie. "That doesn't mean I want you to get sick out in this weather." Trixie begrudgingly turned around and went back inside, shooting Twilight a contemptuous look as she crossed the threshold. "Fine, but I'm leaving as soon as the storm is over." "Fine with me," Twi snapped, as she went back into the kitchen to make some orange pico tea. She levitated the box off the shelf and placed it Herbal Green's finest was printed in large letters on the box, and Twilight wondered vaguely if said Herbal Green actually drank his own product. On the counter, she had just put some water on to boil when a voice called from the other room. "I see I'm interrupting something," came Trixie's snide teasing from the back room, where the Khmer Sutra was still open on the floor. "Oh, Buck." She ran into the other room and saw, to her horror, that the blue unicorn was laying in front of the book, paging through it, a strange look on her face. "I, was just..." "Was just what? Thinking about how alone you were on a cold night like this? Thinking about how lovely it would be to have another unicorn to do this to you?" Her hoof pointed towards the page Twi had seen earlier, the one with the two unicorns, on top of each other, their faces in places not known to Twilight. "Were you thinking about that rarity friend of yours? How good her horn would feel inside you, teasing you, thinking about..." But she got no further, as she had seen the look on Twilight's face, and suddenly some fear crept into the back of her mind. She was drooling, and had a look that Trixie had only seen in those of the woodland animals when their time had come to make their families grow, as the older ponies told the fillies and colts who asked. "You just made a big mistake," said Twilight, letting her robe fall to the ground, exposing her swollen and glistening wet pussy to the air. She started to walk slowly towards Trixie, who instead of walking sat back on her haunches and stared powerlessly at Twilight as she crossed the last few steps between them and locked her lips with Trixie's. She gasped out around Twilight, so she took the advantage of her temporary surprise to invade her mouth with her tongue. The moment their tongues made contact, the feeling blew Twi away. She never knew how hot and wet another tongue would feel, tracing crazy patterns across her own, but took heart at the fact that Trixie had not pulled away, but instead had started to fight against her with her own. They pulled apart, a glistening strand of saliva connecting their tongues for a moment. Twilight looked down and saw that she was no longer the only aroused one. Trixie's own had become so wet, so pretty. Twi just had to have it. Without words, she lay on her back, showing Trixie what she had to offer in return for her own delicious juices. "Well?" she asked, loving the way Trixie blushed as she beheld Twilight's magnificent plot. Slowly, Trixie lowered her head between Twilight's haunches, but was quickly stopped by her back hoof as she held her away. "I want to be that picture. I want that to be us," she whispered, her voice reduced to a throaty purr by her arousal. Trixie's blush turned into a beetroot red complexion as she turned around, her flanks centering themselves over Twilight's head. She started to lick at the wetness right before her nose, the texture and smell arousing her beyond belief. And then Twilight completed the pose, her horns sliding effortlessly into Trixie's pussy with a wet schlick, and she felt some of her hot juices seep out and settle on her forehead. Trixie screamed with pleasure, forgetting her own task for a moment as she reveled in pure ecstasy. Twilight would have none of this, though. She didn't want to be the only one doing the work after all. Wrapping her back legs around Trixie's head, she moved her head back between her haunches, putting her whole snout into her vag, smearing her face and forehead with her thick, hot unicorn juices. Trixie spluttered for a second, prompting Twi to relinquish some of her hold on her, but she still kept her legs firmly around her neck. and then began moving her horn slowly up and down inside Trixie, creating satisfying noises every time she thrust her horn into her. And Trixie's squeaks of pleasure, muffled by Twilight's tight minge, were bringing Twi close, very close to orgasm. She knew Trixie was close too, the copious amounts of juices now flowing down her face onto her snout were enough to tell her that. "Trixie, I'm so close," she panted between thrusts and licks. Finally, unable to hold it in any longer, she came, squirting thick strands of unicorn sauce onto Trixie, who lapped it up eagerly, relishing the sweet candy taste of her new lover. She was quickly distracted by Twilight, who in her ecstasy grabbed Trixie's plot and slammed her horn all the way into her tight pussy. Globs of cum flowed onto Twilight's face, their thick smell enveloping her in a warm cloud, intensifying her own orgasm. Slowly, the pleasure subsided, both unicorns panting, horn to vag to snout, embracing each other. Twilight turned around to face Trixie, eyes shining, face wet and dripping. "Wow, you truly are great and powerful after all," she whispered, licking her juices off of Trixie's face. "But you still got me with that horn of yours in the end," giggled Trixie, nuzzling Twilight's horn, eliciting a small squeak from her purple lover. Both unicorns started to laugh, their chests heaving against each other. Their laughter was so loud, they both failed to notice the sound of the door opening and closing, and the footsteps coming into the back room. Twilight?" said a confused voice from the doorway. Spike was home.